are you feeling?
I feel like I'm catching up on sleep still at age 52. All the sleep that I missed in my 20s and my 30s, I still feel like I'm trying to balance the books.
That's fair. I feel like, there is like a camel theory of sleep that you can just kind of keep it and like grow it in a hump and, deposit it when you need it.
I have no idea what you're talking about, but it sounds absolutely accurate.
This was the project that I really did first see, and this was the moment when I feel like, it was what the press was largely calling like a neo-goth moment. There were a lot of artists, not a lot, but a handful of artists at that time that were really engaged in maybe a neo-goth visual culture. Mm-hmm. But I feel like it was something that I wonder, did it feel like the right way to talk about your work at the time?
No, it felt like a convenient way of talking about the work because it was a way to organize a group of disparate artists and make them legible in a way that was just, easy for people to sort of encounter ideas that were potentially easy to dismiss unless there was some kind of lens attached to it. And whether or not I ever felt like I shared a lot of commonalities with the artists that I was grouped with, not necessarily.
Were there any, like, of that sort of generation, were there artists that you felt like, oh, this is a peer or this is somebody that I'm really, we're fellow travelers?
It was always presented as if there was much more closeness or much more similarity in our practices than there were necessarily in actuality. So probably the person I can point to that I think that I had the most in common with when I was working actively was probably somebody like Gardar, mm-hmm. who had a preoccupation with a specific period in art history, a specific kind of discursive lens that he was attaching to things, mm-hmm. a certain kind of political bent. That I think that there was a lot of ways that we dovetailed, but then there's a lot of ways that we were totally different. The one thing that I did have in common with a lot of the artists that I was grouped with was just we were all young and we were all, pretty engaged with self-destructive behavior, and the artwork kind of reflected that. So it just on one hand there was this sort of goth thing that's an inaccurate way of organizing that work, and then there was what was actually taking place, which was here's a bunch of people who were all kind of probably not well and like let's lump them together, but you can't really be like, oh, look at this group of artists who are all drug addicts. So instead, there's an easier way of doing that and be like, oh, they're all goth. So
they almost said that though.
Yeah, it was implied.
Yeah, I mean, this was
the camel theory.
This was. I want to go back to that era where you started in New York in order to understand like where you are now, and the image that I feel like was paraded around the most was probably this one. You lighting a cigarette with the blowtorch. When you search the name Banks Violette, this was the image that used to come up. Now I think Vanity Fair has like the rights to the image, and they're not putting that on Google.
Yeah, I had this experience, and I know a lot of other people, my friends and people who were my peers, all had this kind of experience with, people coming to the studio to take photographs of you working, and it would somehow turn into like, hey, do this, hey, do that, and yes, I did definitely light my cigarettes with MAP gas, like 100% hand on a Bible. I use propane to light cigarettes all the time. But that was definitely somebody trying to elicit that. So on one hand, yeah, that's accurate. On the other hand, it is a totally theatrical presentation of what that moment in time looked like. Right. And would I have, if I had been necessarily in my right mind, chosen to reveal that part of myself publicly? Probably not. And I think there was a lot of that. I think, there was a lot of, people weren't necessarily in the greatest position to author the way they were being perceived by people.
Yeah. It was a fascinating thing to watch in the studio because, like, on the one hand, you were really, really private. And there were things that I think were just for you and your world. And then on the other hand, like, seeing how you were able to move and, like, for instance, actually, one of the first times, I think the first time that I met you was I was an intern at the Guggenheim, and they were doing like this young collectors thing and came to the studio.
Yeah.
And you had like the giant Jägermeister piece that you were working on. It was like an incredible performance. Like you went and you it was all the ideas that you were thinking about, but it was the first time that I was hearing it. So you're stringing together Smithson, Hegel, Satanism, and all these things that I am hearing for the first time, and I was like, this dude's a fucking genius. Not to say that you're not, but
I wasn't.
what...
If I'm stringing together Hegel, Satanism, and Smithson, then yeah, I'm definitely not.
It was, but what was fascinating to see after that was that, you'd have other studio visits, and the performance, like then it would be the same speech, and I was like, oh, right, there's some preparation to this, and it was, I don't know, for a young artist, that was it dialed me in because it made me think about like, none of that was untruthful, none of that was coming from a dishonest place, but you're asked to do this thing again and again and again, and how do you not think about like what this looks like, feels like, and appears as, and like how much of that was on your mind in that like period of time?
The things that I refer to and that I gravitate to and cite, within my practice are things that I care deeply about. But they're not necessarily things that, somebody has, deep and intimate, knowledge of Smithson's practice or Satanism or whatever it happens to be. These are things that I think about a lot, and I don't want to misrepresent them. Mm-hmm. So, part of doing these things is figuring out a way to translate what is potentially, this kind of esoteric language or something potentially marginal, and making it something that other people can find themselves within. The perfect example of that is a band that I've worked with a number of times, a band named Sunn. Incredible musicians, incredible composers, but the last time I saw them, they just played at Lincoln Center last year. What they played at Lincoln Center was identical to what they were playing in Brooklyn, like in 2000, whatever, at some lousy, club. What they are doing in Lincoln Center is the same, but those things are really sophisticated. Mm-hmm. And it is really easy to get caught up in like the sort of more outrageous aspect of what they're doing, or the sort of, the pointing a finger at something and being like, oh, look how crazy this is. Right. That's never been something I've been interested in. I'm interested in these things deeply, sincerely, and I'm trying to communicate that, and there has to be a way of translating that. Sorry, this is all very vague.
No, I mean, I think I want to come back to sincerity because I think it holds a major role in how the work comes about, and also like the positioning of certain things. But maybe it's also a good time to just talk about like where that deep sincerity for expressing yourself came from. Like, what's your background with art? What's your background? Like, what made you gravitate towards art in the first place?
I mean, I've always made things. That's kind of how I understand the world, is that I've always been somebody I was always a kid in the back of the class sitting and drawing, and definitely not relating to anything outside. So that's always been how I view things, or related to the world. And I didn't have any kind of background with contemporary art, and certainly didn't really know that much about art history. And I had one of those sort of perfect kind of, what you hope for is the experience that people have in college, which is not a vocational route, but you go there and you're exposed to new information and your world expands, and that's how you discover what you want to do. So I went to undergraduate in New York City after a very long kind of roundabout route of dropping out of high school and doing all sorts of other shit. And then going to undergrad, and my intention was to kind of parlay this kind of thing that I'd always done, being the kid in the back of the class, just doodling, and turning that into it being an illustrator or a graphic designer, something practical, an adult. And then
your grandmother was an illustrator.
She was an illustrator, and she was a really prominent illustrator, and she illustrated some of the original Wizard of Oz books, and she was one of the first Kingfisher syndicated artists, and she had this amazing kind of career as an illustrator. So within my family, it was always looked at, oh, that's a very, very responsible career path, which is fucking not practical. but there was no, so I knew a lot about the history of illustration, but I didn't know anything about contemporary art or much about art history. And I learned that in undergrad and realized, oh, this is this kind of discourse that I want to be engaged with. And I was in school in New York City, so there was plenty of opportunities to meet professional working artists in galleries. And, that's how I got involved with that.
So for me, like in high school, I had an art teacher who, I liked to draw too, and it was more about verisimilitude and a skill set that I was like, oh, I can do this thing. But then he kind of showed me that it was a way to, to think through the world, to think through ideas, that you could embody philosophies into an artwork or like a sculpture or a drawing, whatever it might be. And that was through Sigmar Polke, Gerhard Richter, Arthur Danto. That was like the things that lit me up, where I was like, holy shit, I had no fucking idea.
Yeah.
Who were the artists that lit you up in that particular moment that you were like, oh, this is the club I want to be a part of?
For contemporary art.
Or whatever it was, like, because if you're an undergrad and you're saying, oh, this is something that I want to do, what was that click in art history that like started to itch at you?
I think one of the first things, this is going to sound strange, and I remember when we had a previous conversation in Connecticut, I had said this before, and it seemed kind of odd, was just seeing images of Judd at Marfa, and there's something about that I responded to just kind of immediately, as a teenager, and making album cover art and flyer art for punk rock bands and playing in bands and stuff like that, sort of assembling and creating this kind of culture that I was a direct participant in an active way. And sounds really vague. I think that there's something really specific to that experience, the idea that like you have to be an active participant in the culture that you are consuming, instead of you turn on the radio and something is handed to you, but instead you have to manufacture these things all out of whole cloth. So that sense that art had some kind of connection to a broader kind of social thing, I already had in my head.
In like a DIY sense.
In a DIY sense, and seize the means of production kind of sense, that there was really, you are responsible. For creating things. That sounds very Pollyanna-ish, but I think that there was something about seeing Judd, that fully realized kind of landscape that this art inhabited, and it was architected around this person's vision. It was like, oh shit, this is not that dissimilar to, well, I designed this T-shirt for this band and this thing, and now that is part of a collective social and cultural history that all these people are engaged with. Like there is a very weird not one-to-one, but there's a thread that unifies those things.
Right. And it is about like contributing to a culture and potentially shifting a culture.
Sure.
But it's not about like this is me, this is the singular genius. It's like you see yourself as contributing to something, and like potentially that's the charge of it, that it is something larger than simply like one person's gesture. I
think that was the biggest part about going to school and being exposed to people who were actively showing, and this is what a gallery is, and this is anybody can go there. And before, if you don't have a relationship to that and you're looking at it from the outside in, it all seems very terrifying. You know, and it is designed to be a wholly exclusive space that is condescending in the extreme, and then you suddenly get involved with it and you're like, oh shit, no, it's not. Like, it is a forum like any other. Like, booking a VFW hall for your shitty hardcore band is not much different than curating a group show. Like, kind of.
That's great. But you went to grad school, you went to Columbia for grad school, and you had your first solo show while you were in grad school, right? Yeah.
No. I was first year of grad school. I had met a woman who's an incredible video artist, Laura Parnas, who ran a not-for-profit art space in Williamsburg called Memento with her husband. And I had seen her at a show at Participant when Participant was at Broadway, and it was this really amazing kind of very gnarly kind of punk rock video kind of thing. So I wanted her as a video artist, a visiting artist at Columbia. She came, I had her to the studio. She was into what I was doing. She invited me to do a 2-person thing at Momenta because that's how they did their programming. They would do 2-person sort of spotlight shows. So I did that at the end of my first year in graduate school and kind of just went out into the ether. But I did have one person who responded to that, and it was this guy named Jose who had just opened this gallery team in Chelsea, and he had his own long, weird history. But he came to the studio when I was in grad school, and he invited me to do a show. And so I already had a show in a gallery lined up, by my second year of grad school, which probably made me like the most insufferable fucking person to be around, to be honest. But yeah, it was did that, and that also kind of like I did the show and it went out into the ether, and but
that, I hope you don't mind me bringing this up. The story that I remember, and I need you to correct me if I'm wrong, but that you couldn't show, basically the dean at Columbia said that you couldn't show the work for that show as your thesis show, that you had to make a new body of work.
It was way worse than that. This story's way worse than that. Like I got in an argument with the guy and ended up throwing something at the wall, and I didn't realize that he was standing right by the wall, and it was a whole thing. And there was like a departmental restraining order, which I've never heard of before, but it was this thing that like I could not be in the room with him.
Right.
It was great. It was right at that moment when Columbia was sort of transitioning from its sort of older, kind of very kind of, Madison Avenue, second generation Abex teachers to, staff that had been kind of poached from Yale, and they were trying to shift the emphasis of that program. So it was really, there were some internal conflicts in the way that program was structured, and I think I was kind of the casualty of that. Also, my aim was not fucking awesome, apparently, so...
The show that you ended up doing at Team, was that Arroyo Grande?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Yeah. So that was, it was...
It's hard to find pictures of that one.
Yeah.
But can you, to me, I think there are some like immediate concerns from that exhibition that still carry through to what's happening now. And, it's based on a very specific event. Which is the murder of this young girl.
Yeah. I'm not unhappy with the show. It was a way of working through a bunch of different ideas and sort of having them coalesce. But I can look at it now and be like, oh, that was a clumsy first attempt at kind of addressing these set of concerns, be it, subcultures and the way people sort of organize themselves in these potentially very antagonistic kind of ways, the exigencies and excesses of faith, the sort of what does it mean to look at something that is a horrific thing? What does that mean for a viewer? So those are all ideas that later on sort of spun out into things like the Whitney show that we started talking about in the first place. It may have been a much more flat-footed attempt at addressing those ideas and kind of sorting out why am I interested in these things in the first place. But yeah, it was.
But this was a murder that was documented where these teenage boys murdered this young girl in. I guess purportedly because they're listening to a
Slayer.
They were listening to Slayer.
Yeah, I mean they had a band. There was some dim idea on their part, and it's always one of those things where you're like, how much of this is true, and how much of this is somebody writing this to make it conform to these preconceived ideas of what this looks like. But it was this group of teenage boys in Arroyo Grande, California, who were huge Slayer fans and had a band and decided that they were going to kill their classmate as a way of, propitiating Satan, having like the Dark Lord sort of support their shitty garage band. which is even describing that is glibly skipping over that this is a tragic thing,
Right.
and there is, I think that kind of tension at the heart of it is fundamentally kind of really interesting. That like, the narrative becomes a way that we can wall off trauma or calamity or render it legible. And if you are engaged with manufacturing that narrative, you are complicit in that process and alienating, the horrific fact of what you're referring to.
So then the story becomes kind of a veil to cover up something else.
Yeah, and it's also that idea of like, okay, we're now talking about stories, and that these group of teenagers believed this story and believed it to such an extent that they had to enact it in real world terms. And what's the ultimate kind of period at the end of any sentence? It's death. So the way of realizing that in its grossest form was the murder of their classmate. And that's not an alien event. I mean, there's this, you could look at, we started talking about Tipper Gore and that kind of hysteria that I experienced in the 80s with satanic panic and all those kind of things. But you could trace that backwards to, Goethe writing Sorrows of Young Werther and how that was supposedly responsible for an endless series of, copycat suicides to the point where it was banned in some countries and cities. The pedigree for these ideas isn't solely based on a bunch of Slayer fans in the 1980s. It is a thing, a kind of queasy relationship to fiction that precedes and anticipates that in a number of different points and in instances throughout history.
So there's a difference between being the artist that basically causes a death, where that hinge between fiction and reality opens up and something fucked up or psychotic happens. In your work, it tends to be that you are always observing or kind of playing the role of accomplice. Mm-hmm. And that I don't know, that like, I remember there was was it in Germany? You had a show with Ouija. It was a Ouija show, and it was sort of you and Ouija.
Yeah.
And that was like a really fascinating premise because, it was sort of a similar condition where this is a photographer who's kind of going to these insanely gruesome events, and there's a complicity in sort of documenting something like that and sort of blowing it up.
And the complicity with Ouija is even more. It's the part where I find it queasy is the manipulation of the photograph. It wasn't purely documentary.
Right.
It was manipulated. It was manufactured to a certain point. And what does that mean when you elaborate calamity and trauma and tragedy as a fiction, which is what happens when you start, I'm going to edit out this part because it just doesn't work formally, conceptual, whatever.
Right.
There is something very hard for me to process. I don't know if that's myself personally, but like that is always something that I'm like, what does that mean? What does that mean if I'm referring to these things? And I don't think you can do it casually. And hopefully I have not done it casually. I can't say that 100%, but I've done my best to make that idea apparent.
I don't think it was ever casual. I think that it doesn't matter how serious you are about your own practice. People can look at it and say, oh, that's fucked up. He's doing fucked up stuff. Fuck him. Yeah,
I mean, but that's the weird fucking irony of that, what we first started talking about, of that grouping that took place, of that categorization of myself and my peers and blah, 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 that like, I'm obviously preoccupied with the idea of like, oh, you're being subsumed within a narrative, and then having a personal experience of what that looks like when there is a narrative that is being draped over you that you don't necessarily agree with, it doesn't fit really well, is super, super fucking uncomfortable, but it still exists and is kind of choking you.
This was a dual show at Gladstone and Team, and I don't even remember what you had to go through to get the fire department on board, but having open flames like this inside a gallery is
We
not
didn't
an
get the
easy
fire
thing.
department on board. Also not OSHA approved.
This is the Jägermeister piece that I saw in the studio, and yeah, you would think that the studio is like some airplane hangar, but it was a pretty, like, it was big, but it was
big.
it was crowded.
Yeah.
And like it was you're a real worker. Like everything that comes out of that studio, I think there was a moment where I remember when I was working for you and like people would come up to me and like ask me where we get our things fabricated.
Yeah.
And I was like, there, we do we do everything. And there was like an ethic about that, and kind of when you're talking about the discomfort of what it means to talk about these ideas and to be in that place, I think part of the honesty of it is also there's an honest labor relation. There's an honest sense of like, this is what I grew up with, this is what I think about, this is what I love, and I also know there's a darkness here that I'm trying to think about and work through, and like it all kind of spills out into these forms that have to do with sort of complicity and almost like being late to the performance.
Yeah. I mean, I like the idea of late to the performance, or that kind of anticipatory experience of I'm waiting for the thing to happen. Or caesura, that idea of sort of like the pause between something that like all those are things that I find incredibly beautiful. I think with this specifically, and that idea of like fabricating everything by hand, this is a total digression, but another thing that I'm also very interested in is, so sort of like a class language or class vocabulary, specifically in an American sense, whatever that might mean. I think anybody who's worked in an art warehouse has had an experience sort of throwing out their back, moving a dematerialized art object.
I herniated a disc.
Yeah, there is what does it mean when you've rendered labor discrete? Like what happens when the act of fabrication is something that happens over there with a series of anonymous actors. And I had after grad school worked for other artists and been a fabricator and knew lots of people who also had that job. I mean, there's this whole sort of strata of people who are responsible for the creation of things that don't have an identity, and I think there's something kind of fascinating about that. I'm not necessarily saying that's purely problematic, but it is a seam to pick at,
right?
And
there's so many new ways to fabricate too.
Yeah.
Like there was this purity about painting for quite a long time where it's like, oh well, that's the artist's hand, and now there's just so many people that get their paintings made in China and then ship it over. And that there's a way to think about the complicity in that if you're being honest about it. Like I think if that's a part of production for you, then that's a condition of what you're thinking about and talking about. But,
absolutely.
I'm curious, like, is that...
I think you have to think about that. I think you have to take that. I think if you are just accessing that because that is a thing that you can access and it is a way to go from point A to point B, I find that kind of lazy. But if instead there is a structural logic for why you are making things in a certain way, like, I know an artist who does have paintings fabricated in China, but that is part of the discursive framework that he's erected around his work. That makes sense. And then there's other people that you can see, and it's a lazy way of doing things. It's an unconsidered kind of gesture, and what I respond to with art most of the time is that this is something that is thoroughly considered. It is all of it is. It's not necessarily a rational like gesture, but it is somebody thinking through the totality of a problem or an issue or an idea.
Like Judd.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect example. Like this is somebody who is exploring all the dim, unlit corners of this particular idea. And the idea is just, it's a box that's on the ground. Fuck, that's amazing.
You were talking about like the rigor that artists might have that you sort of believe in when you're really affected by an artwork. Mm-hmm. But the other side of that is like, do you see a difference in the world of art journalism when you were coming up and art journalism now?
No, not necessarily. And this isn't really even like a criticism, directed at writers. I just think like, it is an apples and oranges kind of thing, and there's no one-to-one, writerly way of translating, an art idea, and vice versa. That there is always going to be some gap and some kind of slippage, and there's always going to be, as a consequence, resentment that like, well, you didn't get that right. But it's impossible to get it right.
Sure.
That's just the nature of it. So I think that is a constant condition that exists in art writing. So yeah, I don't think that there's much difference between then and now. I just think that is a inherent structural flaw.
Did you like, going back to the moments when you're doing flyers for shows, things like that? Was music journalism like a different space? Did it feel like it was more in the fabric of the scene?
Yeah, I mean, I still think, okay, now this is me undermining exactly what I just said. There is good art writing, absolutely, no question. But I like writing on film. I like writing on music. Like I find the people who write about those things, like or the product that they put out there in the world is much more interesting, much more engaging than a lot of what is written about art. And I couldn't point a finger at why
Sure.
that's the case, but yeah,
Yeah, I think it's only just to say that there is people are trying to figure it out. People are trying to figure out like why. What are the problems with art writing, and what are we missing sometimes? And I feel like with music writing, you can feel a diehard fan.
Yeah.
And with art writing, you're not supposed to be a fan. And I think that's like when you do read that, it's like, oh, this person's just, they love this shit too much, and it's like it's a negative.
Yeah.
But there are those moments when it can transcend the form because there's such a love there.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, that music is this thing that you sort of experience viscerally, and that in cinema, sort of like, doesn't matter if it's horror, porn, or comedy, that those elicit a visceral response. And then art is this thing that is supposed to be rarefied. It is not visceral. It is a mental experience, and I think that is a I don't know, a sort of, cultural bias that's sort of built into the way things are written about and interpreted, that like, you're not supposed to have that fan response to something, which I've always found very off-putting, because I absolutely have a fan response to stuff. I am, it doesn't matter if it's a Void song or a Smithson artwork, like my response to that is, holy shit, unadulterated enthusiasm in the dumbest kind of way possible. Not dumbest, but like just like a raw joyfulness in relationship to something. So it doesn't mean that it's not critical. The criticality is still there. That's still the lens. You can't get rid of it as soon as you've built it.
I think that might be more you, though. I think there are people that see something, hits a nerve, and they're completely uncritical.
Yeah.
And move accordingly. But I think the thing that's fascinating about how your work has moved throughout the years is that there's something, you felt something touched a nerve, that was real, that reverberates, and then it's almost like trying to puzzle out what the fuck is happening and why, and what is it? Is this connected?
Yeah.
Is that connected? It's almost like so much feeling kind of pushes you into a space of like figuring out the conspiracy of your feeling.
That is a really great way of describing it. And it's probably pretty accurate. Yeah, no, that's, but it's also needing to know the broader kind of context that these things exist within. So it's not just purely the object in isolation, but it is what is the kind of framework that is allowing that object some kind of ability to resonate. So, which again, going back to the Marfa example, which is just sort of like, it is not just the object, but it's the stage that the object sits on. And,
Right.
and the use of the word stage is really specific,
Right.
and tying back to what you were first talking about with stages and theater and those kind of things. That, like, it's not just the event, but it's the framing device surrounding the event.
And then you left the stage.
Yeah.
So why did you leave?
Health would be the first reason. You saw what my studio was like. It was my reasons for working the way that I did still make sense to me. Absolutely still agree with them, but it was just not sustainable. Like that maintaining that kind of schedule, maintaining that kind of, I don't know, like weird prominence that I sort of managed to get at a certain moment in time. Maintaining this idea that I had to insistently produce everything by hand to a degree. All that was just kind of sort of psychotic. And the only way to sort of, resolve that and make it not psychotic was a shit ton of drugs, which is clearly not the best way to navigate anything. And so at a certain point, the drugs went out, and it was just, okay, like, do I want to keep beating my head against this wall, or do I want to get healthy? I'm also not happy with the art world. I'm not happy with, having watched a few of my friends pass away, and, see the way people respond to that. And, just, it was a whole lot of unhappiness fueled by a whole lot of unhappy things. So I chose to absent myself, and I thought it would be a brief, I'll take a week off. And then it became 2 weeks, and then it became 3 weeks, and then 3 years. And so a decade and some change later, that's how long it took.
And how does it feel now?
Weird. But it felt weird then. So there's some internal consistency running through that. So that's fine. I still maintained relationships with galleries, and I still produced work. I just wasn't eager and enthusiastic about the idea of presenting work out there in the public. And I had, a almost accidental sort of, two events that kind of, butted up up against one another in 2023, 24. One was I did a museum show that turned out to be kind of a retrospective that was in Belgium, and I'd suddenly in this position of, encountering works that I have not physically seen, for years and years and years, and pulling them out and being able to see them again and go, oh, okay, like that, this is making me think about things again, and here's some threads that I want to pick back up. And then Hetty, who is the designer of Celine, invited me to do this big project. So I was making new work. So I was suddenly forcibly confronted with older work and being asked to make newer work by somebody who I deeply admire and have a pre-existing relationship with and trust. If those two things hadn't happened, if they hadn't happened back to back, would, a decade have turned into 2 decades? Fuck if I know, but possibly. So.
Yeah, that seems really possible, actually.
Yeah, totally possible.
The collaboration with Hetty is deep. I mean, you designed, when he was at Dior, you designed like the back showrooms, or I can't remember.
Yeah, in Osaka. And that was around the time I did that show at the Whitney. So I think he and I...
So it's a long-standing relationship.
Long-standing relationship. And then I think he took that photograph of me smoking with the propane tank, so that's his fault.
I mean, he's good at playing certain things.
He's really good at that.
Yeah.
So, but that's one of those, like, I think in the moment when you're doing something where you're like, oh, this person is being very knowing about it, you forget that, like, oh, right, this is ending up in Vanity fucking Fair and will then haunt me for the next God knows how long. So at the moment, it seemed like a great idea. But that's sort of true of almost everything I've done.
I didn't even smoke cigarettes, and I was lighting cigarettes with a propane torch.
It's good.
But then this is a more recent collaboration where there were 14 chandeliers that went essentially across the world in different Celine stores.
Yeah, and they were all, they all have very specific footprints, because of the limitations of the spaces, so everything had to, correspond to that footprint. It wasn't that they were custom made specifically for that. They're meant to have an identity outside of that. They are sculptures, but they were, they were meant to, exactly that, be in 14 different locations, all being installed within a very tight window of time. And so they had to be made in a certain way that people that you've never met would be able to sort of decipher these instructions, and which also necessitated me shifting from, I used to make all this stuff by hand, to now I have to work with fabricators, which is this thing that I've steered away from for many different reasons, and establish a relationship with these people. So it was a whole fucking huge transition, and thankfully it worked out really, really well, and I'm super pleased with it, and it allowed me to reimagine how I might make things in the future.
I think in a way, the way that I've thought about fabrication for myself is that it's always based in relationships.
Yeah.
And it feels similar. Like, I think you took a long time getting to know Arik and Serena.
Yeah.
So Arik and Serena run a fabrication company called Shisan Wu, which they do many artist fabrication, and they're incredible. And there's it still feels very homespun when you work with them.
Yeah, I mean they're the loveliest people possible, but they're, I still have it in my head that they've got to be somebody who I'd be comfortable at 5 a.m.
Right.
Doing something like, hey, let's see if this looks better if it's burning, like that kind of thing, and establishing it is not unrealistic to describe that as a trust thing.
Who was the dude at Steel Deck that?
Oh, Christian. Yeah. He was down for like burning kind of everything. Anything. Didn't matter. Yeah, he was amazing. He was really, really great guy.
That was a person that was a fabricator who helped fabricate a lot of the steel, like kind of steel structures.
Well, he did, and then it just turned into this like, well, I want to do that. I don't want to rely on this guy. But he had a studio very close to mine in Williamsburg, and he was part of an English company that made steel staging decks, and you can see them all the time. Like, it's a really very distinctive design for a decking system. And it was, it's this huge company, but it was really just this one guy on a also tremendous amount of drugs with a lot of heavy tools, just building these things in Williamsburg. So clearly we got along great. Christian.
I came to the studio right when you were trying to get clean.
Yeah.
And I had never done any drugs at that point. And then all of a sudden I was working in this studio where a big dude would come to the door late at night, and we'd get deliveries of cocaine, and then that would fuel everybody else till the wee hours of the morning to get work done, and then I'd go home around 2 because I was like, I can't do this.
Smart.
But then it felt like there was an urge to get clean. There was like an urge to sort of leave that behind. Did you feel like it was part of you as an artist at that point?
I mean, I never did it, the reason why I was doing drugs was not because I was like trying to, I was not having a good time.
Yeah.
That wasn't like, I'm going to go out and get crazy or anything. All I wanted to do was be able to work. And if I could stay up for 48 hours, that was great. And if this would allow me to stay up for 48 hours, that seemed like a reasonable fucking trade at that moment because the window is really tiny.
That was there. Okay, so this is a real story that to this day, I still kind of don't believe that I saw it. But Banks would disappear from time to time. And then
Like a decade.
Well, yeah. But like we'd be working in the studio and we're like, where the fuck is he? And it would be like a week. And then you show up like fucking nuts. And you go and build, like to his point that he did it to work. He built out a whole wall of cabinets and like a level area for our chop saw in a day. Like everything was level, everything was perfect. And we just see him. And it was like one of those like cartoon montages where you just see like someone like, and then it just finished and it was done. And we're like, this is really good. It was all like sound.
Yeah.
It wasn't about you partying. It really was like.
Yeah, it was purely work.
Yeah, it was a bizarre thing to witness.
Yeah, and it's for whatever. Call me super lucky. I've got an atypical response to opiates. Like, they make me stay up and work really, really hard. Like other people, like, it's how somebody might describe like doing meth or something like that. Like I do heroin and I work really hard. That's really fucking weird, but it is true.
The come down's not so great.
Come down sucks. Yeah. It's not fun. So yeah, that was kind of the backstory for it. But it was just all that period was just being hyper conscious of this very tiny window. And the way this window was being constructed was like, oh, you and all your young friends who are young artists. And you're like, cool, I'm not going to be young at some point. Mm-hmm. So I need to make a volume of work that overcomes this kind of built-in flaw in the way the work is being described as solely a product of youth, right? Mm. And I've got to get ahead of that somehow, which is a psychotic kind of expectation to have of yourself daily. And and in my very dysfunctional way of navigating that at that moment in time, the solution was like, well, I'll just do a ton of drugs. And I was surrounded by a peer group and that moment in time, that wasn't that atypical.
Yeah, like, it was. I mean, it was noticeably toxic, and
it was fucking terrible.
Didn't I wasn't like, oh wow, this is it. Yeah. It felt like when does this run out? I mean,
it's like, seeing, Dash Snow, who's got such a distinctive face, and his work is constantly sort of being churned back up, and sort of seeing him being sort of used almost like a metonym for a moment in time where we're all young and crazy, and you're like, dude, that's a tragedy. That was a sad thing that happened, and there's no sense of joy to that. So yeah, that's I'm still queasy about that when I see that, and sort of discussing that moment in time, and
Yeah. If there was an artist that you could bring back from the dead,
Stephen Brino, easily. 100%. So I mean,
why?
Why? I would be just fascinated seeing him sort of respond to people. Like, he did not sell a lot of work while he was alive. Like, people certainly knew who he was, but not to the degree that they do now, and to the degree that he's discussed and, the regard his work is held in. I think he would find this shit funny as hell. He would find it hilarious. But I also would like him to have the vindication of being like, you know what, you were absolutely right, what you were doing. And he was the loveliest, most generous person that I had the good fortune to know and be friends with. And he, had this community of people that he supported and was deeply involved with and cared tremendously about. And so it would be just to have the like, hey, yeah, totally, people will acknowledge and recognize that you were very important. So, yes.
I think with that, maybe we'll open it up to the audience.
Yeah, what did you do from your time frame in the art world, like when you had a hiatus, and like what were some challenges that you had to overcome? Yeah, basically that.
If I'm understanding correctly, like what did I do with myself for a decade?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, I got married. I became a stepdad, which was like I had a normal life, which I did not have, when I was in New York and working all the time. That like when you're presented with a situation where like being a drug addict seems like a rational response to your environment, then like fuck, normalcy is kind of great. So I was just like normal and quiet, and I was still producing art and still thinking about art, but it was that putting it out in the world and framing it in a way that is that I would be excited about and wanted to engage with, that I steered away from. So it has left me with this happy thing of like, I'm doing a number of shows now, and each time somebody invites me to do something, I'm like, oh great, that's covered, because I've got 10 fucking years of back inventory for lack of a better description. So, it's really easy to, sort of show me the space, and I've probably got something that I've thought about that will work exactly with this. So does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. And also, how does it feel to like speak again, like within your visual language that you want to showcase?
It actually is. It's really nice. Yeah, I mean that's the again. I don't want to give the impression that I don't, that I think art can take place in a vacuum, that like me monologuing in a studio is being a practicing artist, because I don't think that's the case. I think art is fundamentally a kind of communication. It is a dialogue with the outside world, and that is a necessary thing for an art object to have its status as an art object. So re-entering a discussion is re-entering this thing that I love deeply, and I've managed to become alienated from for a variety of different reasons, So yeah, it feels really good.
You did a lot of fishing too.
I did. Yeah.
Everybody, thanks to Banks.
Thank you.